Welcome back to the Morning Blend. We get a whole lot of advice when it comes to our food and our health, and it can be so confusing if not overwhelming. So here to make shopping a little bit easier is Dr. Travis Stork from the Emmy award-winning program, The Doctors. Good morning to you, Doctor.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
I'm so glad that you're here. We've been talking about this all morning long. You can have every intention because we all hear that we're supposed to have more whole grains. I go to the grocery store, I look at those labels, I look at the bread, it looks fantastic, and then you find out it doesn't really have that much in it that's good for us. So what gives? Do you agree that it's confusing when we visit the grocery store?
Oh, it's absolutely confusing. That's part of why I preach whole grains, not only telling people how important it is to your health, but how do you find it? Because really quickly, people who eat enough whole grains tend to be closer to their ideal body weight. They can decrease their risk of heart disease, improve GI health, and yet when you go to the store, just because something is of a darker hue doesn't mean that it's whole grain. So you have to be able to read the packages and figure it out.
Okay, so walk us through this if you would. We're looking at the list of ingredients. What exactly are we looking at? And it matters what comes first, right?
It absolutely does. So if a package just says made with whole grain, that doesn't mean whole grain is the very first ingredient. So what you need to do is learn that, number one, there's 20 plus different types of whole grain. Wheat is the one we know most commonly, but oats, buckwheat, quinoa, bulgur, those are all whole grains. But the way most of the packaged foods, whether it's cereals, breads, or pastas, just turn the package onto its side, look at the ingredients list. The very first word should be whole. So if it says whole wheat as the first ingredient, you know that's the most common ingredient. But if it just says wheat flour, or sometimes it'll say enriched wheat flour, that doesn't mean whole grain. And remember, the whole grain still has all the fiber and the nutrients, but when they refine a grain, they take that out. That's why just plain old white bread acts more like sugar in your body.
Well, and I think just the word enriched is kind of confusing because you think, oh, if it's enriched, it must be fantastic. But so the first word we should be looking at should say whole.
Yes, yes. And the good news is there have never been more choices out there when it comes to whole grains. As part of this whole grain initiative, I actually partner with General Mills because now with their cereals, they tell you exactly how many whole grains are in each serving. More and more products are doing that. And so part of it is understanding that in the past, you might need to make snacks for a party and there wouldn't be a whole grain option. But now whether it's cereal, the bread you're going to put your lunch or build your lunch around, the pasta you're going to have for dinner, even snacks. There are so many whole grain options out there, but the first ingredient has to be a whole grain, otherwise you're not going to get as much of a benefit. And sometimes it's even 5th or 6th on the ingredient list. That means you may be getting 5% whole grains in that particular item.
Okay, I'm glad you're talking numbers, Dr. Stork, because I was reading that the U.S. Dietary Guidelines for Americans that was released just last year rather, was that more than 95% of Americans do not get the minimum 48 grams of whole grain that's recommended daily. So 48 grams, is that kind of a guideline for all of us in terms of knowing how much is going to be a meaningful amount of whole grains?
It is, and remember, it's a lot easier to get the amount you need than anyone would ever think. I have all these whole grains in front of me, and it's to show everyone that you don't have to give up your favorite foods. Again, build your grocery cart around some of these items, and I always say try to minimize the amount of refined grains you're putting in your grocery cart. If you do that, a few servings a day, because that's 48 grams is 3 servings of whole grains. You can easily meet that recommended amount, but again, it's just a conscious decision. When you're going through the cereal, bread, pasta aisle and some of these extra aisles, if you're looking for whole grain and getting it as the first ingredient, I guarantee you'll meet that recommended amount. Okay. But if you're not paying attention, you probably won't.
Okay, so let's talk about that. 48 grams, you said 3 servings. So could I get that if I ate, say, the sandwich that you have there in front of you, maybe a cup of popcorn, and then a whole grain pasta, say a cup or so of that?
Absolutely. And here's the kicker, though, because popcorn is a whole grain. But if you get your lunchtime sandwich on a piece of bread that looks like whole wheat, but it's actually just wheat, 0. If you don't get a whole grain pasta for dinner and it's refined, 0. So that's why you need to make sure. And I also say, if you're going to a restaurant, go ahead and ask, hey, is that whole grain bread? I know it looks like whole grain, but is it actually whole grain? A lot of restaurants are now serving whole grain pasta, and I can't recommend enough to people to try some of these other whole grains. If you've never had quinoa as a side dish, bulgur, this is brown rice instead of white rice, just understanding that these simple side dishes and building your day around whole grains, easy health benefits with minimal effort.
I think that's right. But again, you got to look for that word whole, and you had some great tips today. Thank you so much for joining us on the Morning Blend.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And here's where you can get more information. Check out this website. It's wholegrainnation.com. Now we all know how to go to the grocery store. Up next on the show.